There is a question John Hagee has preached from his pulpit for decades, a question he had aimed at crowds of 20,000, at television audiences in 99 million homes, and at presidents and senators who sat in the front rows of his church. The question is simple. What will you do with Jesus? But today, in 2025, at 85 years old, a different question is following him everywhere he goes. And this one, he cannot answer from a pulpit. This one is being asked by donors, by former members, by journalists, and by people who gave him decades of loyalty and are now looking back with very different eyes. The question they are asking is this: who is John Hagee really? And what exactly was built in his name? Because from the outside, the story of John Hagee looks like one of the most remarkable success stories in American religious history. A boy from a refinery town in Texas. The son of a Pentecostal preacher. A teenager who walked away from a West Point appointment and a football career because of a single night in a church pew. A man who built a congregation of 20,000 members, a media operation reaching nearly 100 million homes, a publishing record that placed 7 books on the New York Times bestseller list, and a political network powerful enough to make presidential candidates compete for his blessing. By almost any measure, John Hagee did what very few people in any field ever manage. He built an empire from nothing. And he built it in plain sight, with millions of people watching and supporting every step of the way. But empires have foundations. And foundations can crack quietly for a very long time before anyone notices the structure leaning. What is happening around John Hagee right now is not a sudden collapse. It is something slower and in many ways more revealing. Old sermons that his team would rather keep buried are resurfacing on social media with millions of views. Longtime donors are asking questions about his personal wealth that his ministry has never fully answered. Critics who spent years on the edges of this story, afraid of the backlash that came with challenging a man this powerful, are finally speaking on record. And the closer anyone looks at the full arc of his story, the harder it becomes to separate the ministry from the contradictions threaded through every decade of it. This is not a story about a man who failed suddenly. This is a story about what happens when the gap between the image and the reality becomes too wide to hold together. And at 85, that gap is wider than it has ever been. John Charles Hagee was born on April 12, 1940, in Goose Creek, Texas. A refinery town sitting on the edge of Houston where the air smelled like crude oil and Sunday mornings smelled like church. His father, William Hagee, was a Pentecostal minister who founded Assemblies of God churches across the region. His mother was equally devoted. And from the moment John could stand in front of a congregation, he was already performing. By age 5, the church already knew him as Johnny, the pastor's boy who sang for adults every Sunday like it was the most natural thing in the world. Church was not something the Hagee family attended. It was something they inhabited. It was the walls around their entire life. But young John was not only a preacher's son. He was also an athlete. And that part of his identity matters more than most people realize, because it tells you something about the man he would become. At Reagan High School in Houston, he earned varsity letters in 4 sports. He became team captain in football. He made the National Honor Society. And before his senior year was finished, he had secured something extraordinary. A commission to the United States Military Academy at West Point. For a kid from a refinery town, that was not just an achievement. It was an escape route. A mapped road toward rank, discipline, and a future that had nothing to do with revivals and offering plates. Then came the night that changed everything. On the second Thursday of January 1958, 17-year-old John Hagee sat on the back pew of his father's church during a revival service. By his own account, he had already quietly decided that once he was old enough, he was leaving church behind. He had West Point. He had football. He had a plan. But during the altar call that night, something shifted inside him. He described it later as an overwhelming call that he could not ignore or explain away. He stood up from the back row, walked to the front of the church, and gave his life publicly to ministry. In less than 48 hours, he withdrew from Reagan High School, turned down West Point, and enrolled at Southwestern Bible Institute in Waxahachie, Texas, 250 miles from everything he had known. His classmates were thinking about prom. He was already living in a dormitory, attending theology classes, and preaching his first sermon at his father's church by the first Sunday of March 1958. The ambition did not disappear when he chose ministry. It simply found a much larger stage to operate on. And what he built on that stage would eventually raise questions that no revival sermon could quiet. The years that followed that altar call were not glamorous. They were grinding. Hagee spent his weekdays in theology classes and his weekends on the road, preaching revival services at whatever small churches would open their doors to a teenager with a Bible and ambition. To cover his expenses, he worked in a church furniture factory during the week. By day he handled pews. By night he stood behind them. There was something almost poetic about that image if you were inclined to be generous. A young man so committed to his calling that he built the very furniture other people sat in while he prepared to preach to them. But there was also something else in that image. A relentless drive to build, to expand, to never stay still. And that drive would define every chapter of his life from that point forward. He did not stop at Bible college. In 1962, he secured a full athletic scholarship to Trinity University in San Antonio as a football walk-on, completing a Bachelor of Science degree in History and Education by the summer of 1964. Then he moved into coaching at Nimitz Middle School, where his teams in football, track, and basketball all won district championships. Then came a master's degree in educational administration from North Texas State University, finished by 1966. The pattern was clear even then. John Hagee did not do anything halfway. He stacked credentials, built track records, and moved toward larger stages with a discipline that would have served him well in almost any field he chose. By October 1966, at just 26 years old, he founded Trinity Church in San Antonio. His first independent congregation. It grew quickly. Within 6 years, the original space was already too small. But then in May 1975, something unexpected happened. Hagee resigned suddenly as senior pastor of Trinity Church. No slow transition. No carefully managed exit. He walked away from the church he had built and took over a struggling congregation of roughly 25 people in Castle Hills, a quiet suburb of San Antonio. He stripped away the old identity, renamed it, and started again. On paper it looked like a step backward. In reality, it was the move that made everything else possible. That struggling congregation became Cornerstone Church in 1987, relocating to a massive campus on San Antonio's north side with room for a sanctuary that would eventually hold one of the largest congregations in Texas. More than 20,000 active members. Television production facilities. Conference infrastructure. A media operation that would grow to broadcast his sermons across more than 160 television stations and 50 radio stations, reaching 99 million homes worldwide. The boy from the refinery town had built something that looked, from every external angle, like proof that the American dream and the gospel could produce the same result. But the questions were already forming underneath the surface. When you build an empire the size of what John Hagee built, money becomes impossible to separate from the story. And the money story around Hagee is one that his ministry has never been fully comfortable discussing in public. In 2001, Global Evangelism Television, the non-profit media arm of his operation, reported more than $18 million in revenue on its IRS Form 990. That number alone was remarkable for a San Antonio-based religious broadcaster. But what drew sharper attention was Hagee's personal compensation package for that same year. Nearly $1.25 million in total. Approximately $540,000 from his role as president of the television ministry. Another $302,000 from Cornerstone Church. Plus additional benefits including retirement contributions that pushed the total even higher. Those numbers placed him among the highest-paid nonprofit executives in the entire San Antonio region. Not among pastors. Among all nonprofit leaders. His defenders would say that a man managing an $18 million media operation deserved executive-level compensation. And there is a version of that argument that holds up in a boardroom conversation. But John Hagee was not presenting himself as a media executive. He was presenting himself as a servant of the gospel. A man called by God. A shepherd of a flock that included thousands of working-class families who were being told from his pulpit that giving money to his ministry was the path to their own financial breakthrough. That contradiction between the message from the stage and the reality in the financial filings is where the criticism stopped being theoretical and started being uncomfortable. Because the theology he preached around money was not subtle. In sermons that circulated widely and were later highlighted by watchdog ministries and online investigators, Hagee quoted Deuteronomy 8 verse 18 and told his audience that it is God's will for them to prosper. He pushed the phrase giver's gain. He connected Luke 6 verse 38 to the idea that a financial offering would produce a miraculous financial return. He described poverty as a curse and taught that people could not access God's abundance until they gave. For supporters, that was encouragement wrapped in scripture. For critics, it was a fundraising system built on spiritual pressure aimed directly at people who could least afford to give and most desperately needed to believe that giving would change their situation. The lifestyle questions made that criticism land harder. Reports from the San Antonio Express-News described his retirement trust as including a nearly 8,000-acre ranch near Brackettville, Texas, valued at approximately $2.1 million, complete with 5 lodges, a gun locker, a skeet range, and multiple barns. Some estimates of his personal net worth in 2025 have placed the figure as high as $50 million. Others have been more conservative. But even the conservative estimates paint a picture of extraordinary personal wealth accumulated over decades of ministry funded almost entirely by donor contributions. And that picture sits uncomfortably beside every sermon he ever preached about sacrifice, faith, and the blessings that come to those who give. Money was not the only place where the gap between John Hagee's public image and his actual record became difficult to ignore. Because running alongside the financial story, for decades, was a trail of statements so inflammatory and so well documented that the only real mystery is how he managed to maintain his platform for as long as he did. The statements about Adolf Hitler came first and hit hardest. In a sermon drawn from Jeremiah 16, Hagee focused on the biblical image of God sending fishers and then hunters to drive the Jewish people back to Israel. From that passage, he made the leap that stunned critics and never fully disappeared from public memory. He said God sent a hunter. Then he named Hitler as that hunter. His argument was that the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people, happened because God allowed it and even orchestrated it as a mechanism to push Jews toward the land of Israel. Because returning Jews to Israel was, in his framing, God's highest priority. That interpretation did not land as nuanced theology. It landed as one of the most offensive things a prominent American pastor had said in public in a generation. Because what it effectively did was remove moral responsibility from the Nazi regime and place the logic of genocide inside a divine plan. Critics from Jewish organizations, from mainline Christian denominations, and from secular commentators said the same thing in different words. You cannot dress up the Holocaust as prophecy fulfillment and call yourself a friend of the Jewish people. The contradiction is too large and too serious to be explained away with context or clarification. But Hagee did not stop there. In other documented statements, he described Hitler as coming from a line of what he called cursed, genocidally murderous half-breed Jews, tying that claim to the biblical figure of Esau. He repeated conspiracy language about the Rothschild family controlling the Federal Reserve and standing at the center of a global financial network, folding that image into his end-times prophecy about the Antichrist and a coming one-world system. These were not obscure remarks buried in decades-old recordings that nobody could find. They were part of his public ministry, available in books and broadcast sermons, and they drew from some of the oldest and most dangerous anti-Semitic myths in circulation. The idea that Jewish bankers secretly controlled the world has fueled violence across centuries. Wrapping it in prophetic language did not neutralize it. It amplified it to an audience of millions. The political consequences eventually caught up with him. On May 21, 2008, during the presidential race, the Hitler sermon resurfaced on political blogs and cable news. The following day, Senator John McCain publicly rejected Hagee's endorsement and called the comments deeply offensive and indefensible. McCain's campaign had originally welcomed that endorsement as a way to reach evangelical voters. Once reporters began pulling the full archive of Hagee's sermons, the political cost became impossible to absorb. And yet even that very public rejection, even the Catholic League controversy, even the NPR interview where he said those who live by the Quran have a scriptural mandate to kill Christians and Jews, and even the sermon where he called Hurricane Katrina God's judgment on New Orleans for its sins, none of it ended his career. None of it closed his church. None of it turned off his television broadcasts. He absorbed every controversy, offered partial clarifications when the pressure became unbearable, and kept preaching to his 20,000 members and his 99 million homes as if the record behind him was someone else's story entirely. And that, more than any single statement he ever made, is what makes the full picture of John Hagee so difficult to look away from. At 85 years old, with his son Matt now carrying the daily weight of Cornerstone Church and with old sermons finding new audiences on platforms that did not exist when he first preached them, the scrutiny is not fading. It is compounding. And the empire that took 60 years to build is finally being examined with the kind of attention it should have received long ago.